In a powerful southern kingdom, where palaces gleamed with white stone and the court was accustomed to welcoming guests with music and gifts of gold, an unusual traveler appeared one day. He was a young prince from a distant northern kingdom. He had come to ask for the hand of the king's daughter, but arrived without a magnificent retinue, without banners, and without a caravan of jewels. Only one faithful squire rode beside him, while the prince himself wore a simple travelling cloak, covered in dust from the long road. He had no intention of impressing the southern court with wealth. The prince wanted to speak to the king directly and openly, offering an alliance between the two kingdoms, based not on advantage and vanity, but on mutual respect. He brought with him no chests of gold, only his word of honor and the forthrightness of the northern wind. The next day, the young prince went for a walk in the palace gardens, wishing to rest a while from the ceremonies and the curious glances of the courtiers. In their most distant corner, where the old paths were overgrown with grass and the stone wall had darkened with age, he unexpectedly saw the princess. She stood beside ancient rose bushes with a grey-haired gardener. She wore simple gloves. The hem of her dress was slightly soiled with earth, and several loose strands of hair fell across her face. The princess was carefully tying up a weak branch and asking the gardener how the roses planted by her great-grandmother had survived the winter. She listened attentively to the old man and answered him with such warmth that he might have been not a servant, but an old friend. The prince stopped without meaning to. He had expected to see a fragile flower in a vase, but instead found a skillful gardener tending the roots of her lineage. The prince did not approach at once, so as not to disturb their work. When the princess straightened, he asked quietly, "Why are these roses so dear to you?" She was surprised. Guests usually asked which variety was the most beautiful, or how old the bushes were. But now she told him that her great-grandmother had planted them in the year of the great drought, and carried water to them herself from the old well. Ever since, the women of her family had guarded the roses as a remembrance of patience and devotion. Then the princess asked, "What are the winters like in the north?" He told her of the snow that lingered for months, of crackling logs, and of the tales people listened to by the hearth, while the wind knocked against the shutters. He did not boast or try to please her. He spoke to her simply, as an equal, and listened carefully to every answer. And in that quiet conversation about old roses and long winters, they learned more about each other than they had from all the ambassadors' reports. When their conversation ended, neither of them wished to return to the palace at once. They both felt that something important had happened among the old roses, though they did not yet know how to name the feeling. The prince suddenly understood that before him stood not merely the daughter of a powerful king, but someone who felt just as confined within the golden cage of duty. From birth, others had chosen their paths, their obligations, and even their future spouses for them. For the first time, the princess had met someone who did not regard her as a prize, did not try to win her favor, and demanded nothing of her. He had seen her true self. What arose between them was not ardent love at first sight, but a quiet recognition. They were the children of two kings, but on that day, for the first time, they felt like simply two people who could be themselves in each other's company. The king did not remain unaware for long. He was used to noticing the slightest changes at his court, and soon saw how his daughter searched for the northern prince with her eyes, how much calmer she became beside him, and how rarely she now spoke of other suitors. This alarmed him more than open defiance would have done. The prince himself did not inspire distrust. The king could see his honesty and dignity. Yet that was precisely why the danger seemed more serious. He feared giving his beloved daughter to a distant northern land, and feared even more losing the right to determine her destiny. For the future of the kingdom, he had long planned another, more advantageous alliance. And now, looking at the quiet smiles of the young couple, the king saw not the birth of love, but the collapse of his own carefully constructed plans. An alliance founded upon feelings alone seemed far too unpredictable to him. The next morning, the king ordered the northern prince summoned to the throne room and received him with conspicuous favor. "You ask for my daughter's hand and an alliance with my land," he said. "But first prove that you can be of use to her, not as a prince, but as a man. Show that you value labor and the land." And the king appointed 3 trials. In a single day, the prince was to clear the stones from an old field that had lain abandoned for many years. Then he was to restore a ruined mountain channel and carry water through it to a withered garden. After that, by sunset of the following day, he was to harvest an enormous field of wheat without losing a single sheaf. The courtiers were silent. Everyone understood that no one man could accomplish such a thing. But the king smiled. He offered the prince not a battle of swords, but a battle against stone, earth, and time. The first trial was an abandoned plot in the royal forest. The earth there had almost vanished beneath ancient boulders, covered with moss, and embedded so deeply in the soil that the mountain itself seemed to hold them by their roots. The prince had to remove the stones and turn the wasteland into farmland. The second trial was the old road to a distant mill and several villages. Rain had washed it away, ravines cut across the slope, and landslides had blocked the passage with heavy clay and tree trunks. It had to be made passable for carts once more. But the third task seemed the most hopeless. At the foot of the mountains lay a stony field that had yielded no crop for many years. The soil had hardened almost to rock, and the prince was to prepare it for sowing. Each of these labours would have required hundreds of people and many months of work. The king had set 3 silent enemies before him: stone, mud, and barrenness. The prince listened to the king until the end and immediately understood his design. These trials were not a test, but a mockery devised to make him abandon his intentions and leave the court in humiliation. For a moment, the pride of a northern warrior spoke within him. He wanted to bow, turn away, and never return. But at the doors of the hall, he saw the princess. She stood in silence, looking at him with anxiety and hope. Then the prince lowered his gaze, as if laying his own pride at the king's feet, and bowed deeply. "I accept your conditions, Your Majesty. I am prepared to labour and prove that I am worthy of your daughter's hand." And in that moment, he performed his first true act of courage. He agreed to exchange his sword for a shovel for the sake of the woman he loved. The next day, the prince put on simple working clothes and went to the stony field. Hundreds of heavy boulders lay before him, and for the first time in many years, he did not know what to do. A sword could not clear a single furrow here, and the strength of one man was clearly not enough. At night, when the palace had fallen silent, the princess came to him in secret. "I saw that you accepted the challenge," she said. "It was noble, but you cannot succeed alone. My father underestimated not only you, but me as well. I will help you." She had not come as a magical fairy, nor did she promise to accomplish the impossible in a single night. She brought plans of the old lands, knowledge of the people, and the locations where the necessary tools could be found. That night, the prince understood that beside him stood not a rescuer, but a true ally. The prince looked at her hopefully, and the princess began at once to speak with such calm precision that it seemed she had long considered every one of the trials. "You cannot manage the boulders alone, but the finest stonecutters in the kingdom live in a northern mountain village. I will send word to them, and they will help." She pointed to the stony field. "It appears dead, but I know families of farmers whose land my father once took away. Promise them a share of the future harvest, and they themselves will wish to bring this soil back to life." Then the princess turned toward the forest. And the road is not completely destroyed. Beneath the mud, roots, and moss lies the old stonework built in my grandfather's time. It need not be constructed anew, only cleared. She knew her land not from palace maps, but from the stories of old people, from its villages, and from the paths she had walked herself. And this knowledge proved more valuable than an entire army. Encouraged by the princess's words, the prince set to work at dawn. Meanwhile, she secretly sent trusted servants to the mountain village, to the stone cutters, and to the families of farmers who could be trusted. Within a few days, dozens of people were already working upon the forgotten land. The prince labored alongside everyone else. He carried stones, swung a pickaxe, helped harness the horses, and demanded no special task for himself. The princess did not remain in the palace either. She brought the workers water and bread, helped stack the smaller stones, and watched carefully to ensure that no one worked beyond their strength. The work gathered momentum. Everyone did what they knew best, and every day the palace spies reported everything to the king. He listened in silence and frowned. His carefully designed plan was beginning to collapse. Day after day, the prince and princess labored side by side, and their former quiet affection imperceptibly grew into something far greater. The prince saw how she spoke with the farmers, carried water to tired workers, and gathered stones from the road with her own hands, fearing neither dust nor blisters. Before him stood no longer merely a beautiful princess, but a strong woman upon whom he could rely. And she saw how he took up the pickaxe at dawn, worked as hard as everyone else, and never retreated from his given word. They needed no lengthy declarations. Sometimes a brief glance across the field or a weary smile at the end of the day was enough. Their love was born not to the music of a ball, but amid stones, dust, and difficult labor. That was why its foundation was the most enduring feeling of all: profound respect for one another. Several weeks passed, and what had seemed impossible was completed. The abandoned forest plot had been cleared of its ancient boulders, and the dark earth already awaited the first seeds. The old road to the mill was level and wide once more, and carts of grain passed over it with ease. At the foot of the mountains, the stony field had been ploughed, fertilized, and sown. Then the prince washed the dust of the road from his hands, put on a modest court doublet, and presented himself to the king. He did not speak of the difficulties or list his achievements. He merely bowed calmly and said, "Your Majesty, I have fulfilled your conditions. Now I ask for the promised reward, your daughter's hand." He came without a sword, but the calluses on his palms spoke more persuasively than any weapon. The king was astonished. He had not believed that the northern prince could complete even one trial. And now he saw before him a man who had kept his word. Something else was even more troubling. During the work, the princess and her chosen one had become nearly inseparable. But the king did not dare openly break his promise. "Well, you have proved your diligence," he said with a gracious smile. "A wedding, however, is not a matter to be rushed. Guests must be summoned, feasts prepared, and every custom observed. From that day onward, endless delays began. At times, the king arranged festivities lasting several days in honor of the completed work. At others, he suddenly invited the prince on a distant hunt, or announced that the ambassadors had not yet had time to arrive. He tried to drown his given word in celebrations and postponements, hoping the prince would one day tire of waiting and leave of his own accord. The prince waited patiently for several more days, but soon understood that the king had no intention of keeping his promise. Then he went to the king himself and said calmly, without threats, "If there is to be no wedding, Your Majesty, I will leave your court and return to the north." This time, the king did not smile. "You are not going anywhere," he replied sharply. "You may remain my honored guest for as long as you wish, but you will not have my daughter." That same evening, the guards at the palace gates were doubled. They were ordered to be impeccably polite, but not to allow the prince beyond the walls. Thus the man, who had arrived with an open word, became a prisoner of another man's fear. Hospitality turned into a prison, and rich chambers into a golden cage. Now the prince understood that he could wait no longer. When the princess learned that the gates had been closed to the northern prince, she saw her father's decision for the first time, without her former excuses. He intended neither to keep his word nor to let them go. If they remained, there would be guards today, another trial tomorrow, and then another obstacle more cruel still. She sat for a long time at the window of her room. It pained her to think of her father. She loved him and understood his fear. But now she saw clearly that love which deprived another person of choice became a form of power. And then something changed within her. She no longer wished to wait for someone else to decide where and with whom she would live. The princess decided to leave. This was not the flight of a frightened daughter from her home. It was her own choice and her own responsibility. She understood that it was better to meet the unknown as a free woman than to remain a prisoner, even in the most beautiful palace. Deep in the night, the princess quietly entered the prince's chambers. He sat beside the dead fireplace, gloomy and tired, not knowing how much longer his honorable captivity would last. "We are leaving tonight," she said. "I have decided." She had brought a small traveling bag with bread, dried fruit, and water, as well as a warm cloak for the road. Then she took out a small carved box and opened it. Upon dark velvet lay 3 ordinary walnuts. "This is my mother's parting gift," the princess whispered. "She told me to open them only in a moment of the greatest, truest need. Each one holds what I will require then." She closed the box and held it out to the prince. "You keep it safe." He accepted the gift carefully, as though he held not 3 nuts, but 3 miracles still asleep. The palace slept as the prince and princess quietly went out into the garden. They did not seek secret underground passages or call servants to their aid. Passing between the dark rose bushes, they reached a low stone wall, climbed over it, and for the first time found themselves together on the other side of the palace walls. Ahead, the old mill road gleamed silver beneath the moon. Only recently, it had been one of the king's trials, broken, overgrown, and nearly forgotten. But now the stones lay evenly. The ruts had been cleared, and the road passed peacefully between the hills. They walked along it side by side, and every stone beneath their feet seemed to recognize them, because they themselves had restored this road to life. What had been a trial was now becoming a path to freedom and to a new destiny of their own choosing. The journey to the Northern Kingdom was long, but neither of them wished to hurry it. By day, they rode through green fields, quiet villages, and cool forests, speaking of everything the palace walls had never allowed them to discuss. In the evenings, they lit a small fire, shared a simple supper, and sat for a long time beneath the stars, listening to the rustle of the grass and the night birds. For the first time, there were no orders above them, no rules of court, and no decisions made by others. They belonged only to themselves and to each other. It seemed to them that every trial was already behind them, while ahead waited a home, a wedding, and a peaceful life. They were exiles without crowns or retinues. Yet they had never felt so free and happy. At last, the borders of the Northern Kingdom appeared ahead, and beyond the green hills rose the familiar spires of the prince's ancestral castle. He stopped his horse and turned to his companion with a smile. "My beloved, I cannot bring you into my home as an ordinary wanderer. You are a princess and must enter it as my future queen." He asked her to wait in a small village near the old castle mill. "I will speak to my mother first, prepare a worthy welcome, and send a carriage and retinue for you. In a few hours, we will enter the castle together." The princess agreed, seeing no reason for concern. He rode away joyfully, certain they would soon meet again, unaware that this brief separation would become the beginning of the longest and bitterest trial of their lives. The Dowager Queen met her son at the very doors of the castle. Seeing him after their long separation, she forgot the courtiers, embraced him tightly, and wept with happiness. But as soon as the prince began to speak of his companion, her expression changed. He spoke of the princess with a warmth his mother had never before heard in his voice. He told of her intelligence and courage, of how she had shared his hardships and left her home for his sake. The queen listened and understood that the person before her was no longer the young man she had once sent on his journey. He had returned as an adult, capable of choosing his own fate. Her heart rejoiced at his happiness. But beside that joy grew an anxious fear. She was no longer the only woman whose word determined his life. The prince continued his story, failing to notice the change in his mother's face. He spoke of his bride's wisdom, of her kindness, of how she had helped him with the difficult labor and left her home together with him. "I gave her my word," he said at last, "and I wish to keep it." The warmer his voice became, the colder the queen's gaze grew. For many years, she had been her son's foremost counselor, his closest companion, the person whose opinion he heeded before all others. Now some foreign girl, whom she had never even seen or chosen, was to take that place. The queen feared more than the loss of influence. Deep in her heart, she dreaded loneliness. But she could not admit this to herself. "He is blinded," she decided. "I must save him." Thus a mother's love imperceptibly transformed into a desire to hold on to her son at any cost. Having resolved to act, the queen hid her unease behind an affectionate smile. She listened to her son until the end, then appeared to yield. "Very well, my son," she said gently. "I see that your decision is firm. I bless your choice. Come to me, and let me embrace you and kiss you for good fortune." The prince smiled with relief and approached his mother. She held him tightly and kissed his cheek. But this kiss was no simple maternal farewell. Within it lived the old, almost forgotten magic of their bloodline. Long ago, the women of the royal family had used it, as they said, to protect their sons from mistaken decisions and keep them near. It was a spell of forgetting, and the kiss that promised a blessing became a seal erasing from the prince's memory the woman for whom he had travelled so far. After his mother's kiss, the prince suddenly felt slightly dizzy, as though he had just awakened from a sleep that had lasted too long. He blinked, passed a hand over his face, and at that moment, the veil of forgetting descended upon his mind. Everything vanished. The southern kingdom, the old roses, the stony fields, the difficult labor, the flight by night, and the woman for whom he had left his former life behind. The most important year was torn from his memory like a page from the book. The prince remembered only that he had wandered through the world for a long time, grown weary, and finally returned home. "I am so glad to be home, Mother," he said quietly. "It seems I was away somewhere for a very long time." The queen smiled and embraced her son again. Triumph flashed in her eyes. She had achieved her aim. The past had disappeared, and her son, as she believed, belonged only to her once more. Meanwhile, the princess waited at the old mill. 1 hour passed, then another, but still no one appeared on the road leading to the castle. By evening, the sky had darkened, and the first stars lit up above the hills. She tried not to worry. They must be preparing a ceremonial welcome at the palace, the princess thought, assembling the retinue and harnessing the horses. But the whole night passed. At dawn, she rose from the bench and peered down the empty road. Neither a carriage nor a familiar rider could be seen. She could not believe that the prince would break his word or forget her. Something terrible must have happened. Every traveller who appeared in the distance made her heart beat faster. But each time her hope faded again. The princess remained by the mill and continued to wait, feeling her anxiety grow heavier with every hour. Another day passed, and by evening, the princess ceased deceiving herself with the hope of his swift return. She understood that he would not come that day either. Of course, she could have gone to the castle gates, announced her name, demanded a meeting, cried out about the promise given to her, and asserted her rights. But the very thought was unbearable. She had come to this land as a future queen, not as a petitioner forced to beg for love. The princess decided to remain nearby. She would wait, observe, and hope. But she would surrender her dignity to no one. That evening, she entered the home of the old miller who had given her shelter the night before. "I need work," she said without giving her name. "Please let me stay and help you." Thus the princess chose not humiliation at the castle gates, but patience and honest labour. The old miller and his wife immediately noticed the stranger's quiet dignity and hidden sorrow. They asked no needless questions, and gladly let her remain with them. Thus began her new life, quiet, simple, and entirely unlike life in a palace. In the mornings, the princess listened as the water steadily turned the heavy mill wheel, as the millstones creaked, and the flour rustled softly. She washed smooth wooden tubs fragrant with fresh timber, swept the floor, and soon learned to bake hot bread for the workers. Warm flour settled upon her palms. The dough slowly rose beside the oven, and the house filled with a familiar, comforting aroma. Her days were now measured not by the chime of palace clocks, but by the steady murmur of the mill. Every evening, she stepped onto the porch and gazed for a long time at the distant lights of the castle. She did not weep. She simply waited. An entire year passed. Life at the mill flowed calmly and evenly, until one morning, the ringing voice of a royal herald broke the village stillness. In the square, it was announced that the prince had finally chosen a bride. At the Dowager Queen's insistence, he was to marry a wealthy and noble duchess from a neighbouring country. 3 days of wedding feasts had been appointed at the palace, and the first guests were to arrive in only a few days. The princess listened as though the ground were slowly slipping away beneath her feet. For an entire year, she had waited patiently, hoping his memory would bring him back to her of its own accord. Now she could wait no longer. She understood that she had one last chance to remind the prince of the past and awaken what sorcery had taken from him. News of the wedding became not the end of her hope, but a call to one final struggle. On the day of the first wedding feast, the princess locked herself in her little room at the mill and took out the carved box she had guarded for so long. The same 3 ordinary walnuts still lay within it. She took the first, carefully cracked its shell, and froze. Instead of a kernel, there was a tiny rolled-up dress inside. The moment the princess touched it, it unfolded and began to shine with a gentle golden light. It seemed to have been woven from the first rays of the morning sun. The little room immediately grew bright, as though dawn had risen within it. That evening, the princess put on the wondrous garment. The humble miller's helper vanished, and the daughter of a king once again stood before the mirror. She secretly entered the palace and mingled with the guests. No one recognized her. But when the stranger entered the festive hall, conversations fell silent, and the courtiers instinctively parted before her radiance. At the first feast, the prince sat beside his betrothed, but was unusually quiet. When he saw the stranger in the sunlit dress, he suddenly felt a strange unease. Her voice seemed familiar, and her smile stirred the memory of something lost long ago. All evening, he found himself searching for her with his eyes. The next day, the princess cracked the second nut. From the shell fell a dress the color of the full moon, woven from the finest silver threads. That evening, she appeared at the palace again. The prince saw her and seemed to forget everything around him. For an instant, a distant garden flashed before him. He smelled wet roses after rain, saw someone's hands in simple work gloves, and heard his own voice promising never to retreat. He had not yet remembered her, but his heart had already begun to awaken. On the third and final evening, the princess cracked the remaining nut. From its shell unfolded a dress that seemed woven from pure starlight. Thousands of tiny sparks shimmered upon the fabric, and it appeared as though the night sky itself had descended upon her shoulders. When the princess entered the hall, the prince immediately rose from the table and went to meet her himself. This time, she did not wait. Remember, Prince, the old mill where you left the woman who trusted you. Remember the dusty road we restored to life together. Remember the stony field where we worked side by side and understood for the first time that we loved each other. She spoke calmly, without reproach. True love can be erased from memory, but it cannot be torn from the soul. The prince looked at her, and behind her words, forgotten images of the past began to emerge, one after another. Her words seemed to have found the key to a door that had remained locked in the prince's memory for an entire year. He looked at her and suddenly noticed the simple linen ribbon around her wrist. Once, on the night of their departure, he had tied it there himself, so the reins would not chafe her hand. And that was enough. The veil of forgetting began to disappear. Not in a sharp flash, but in a quiet, warm wave. The past returned to him. The old garden and the scent of roses. Heavy stones beneath his hands. The road under the moon. Campfires among the forests. Her laughter, and his promise to return for her at the mill. He remembered everything. The prince spoke her name so quietly, as though afraid of losing her again. There were tears in his eyes, of happiness, pain, and remorse. Memory returned, not only to his mind. It returned to the place where it had always lived, his heart. Having remembered everything, the prince did not turn the wedding feast into a public trial. He merely took the princess by the hand and quietly led her out of the hall. The following morning, the first thing he did was go to the Duchess. He told her the entire truth about the distant southern kingdom, the woman to whom he had given his word, the spell of forgetting, and the memory that had returned only the night before. "Forgive me," said the prince. "I cannot become your husband, because my heart has long belonged to another. To continue with this wedding would mean deceiving both you and myself." The Duchess was silent for a long time, then calmly accepted his decision. Perhaps she herself had never wanted the marriage, thus the betrothal was ended without humiliation or scandal. The prince came to her not with excuses, but with the truth, and in doing so, showed her the greatest respect. After settling every matter at the palace, the prince went neither to the throne room nor to his mother. He went to the old mill. There he saw the princess as she had lived for the past year, in a simple dress, with her sleeves rolled up, among sacks of flour and the warm aroma of fresh bread. She raised her eyes when he entered. The prince approached her and, demanding nothing, sank to one knee in the flour dust. "Forgive me for leaving you to wait alone. I did not wish to forget you, but I know how much pain my forgetting caused you." The princess looked at him for a long time, then smiled and helped him rise. "I was not waiting for your memory," she said quietly. "I was waiting for you, and you came." Thus at the old mill, they found each other for the second time. Later, the prince and princess returned together to her native kingdom. The king met his daughter with mixed feelings. He was happy to see her alive, but could not forget her escape or his own humiliation. Yet the person before him was no longer the girl he was accustomed to protecting and directing. The princess calmly told him of the road where carts travelled once more, of the field that had yielded its first harvest, and of the people who had found work thanks to their shared labour. The king listened and gradually understood that his daughter had not destroyed his plans. She had become capable of building her own. He had expected the return of a disobedient girl, but saw a wise woman prepared to answer for her own choices. Anger gave way to pride. The king embraced his daughter, then offered his hand to the prince, and blessed their union with all his heart. Soon the wedding was celebrated, quiet, bright, and entirely unlike the lavish festivities of the court. At one table sat two kings, the old miller and his wife, the stonecutters, and the farmers with whom the couple had once cleared the fields and restored the road. In time, the two kingdoms united. The prince and princess ruled them wisely, remembering that a land rests not only upon decrees, but also upon the labour of those who live upon it. And their story became a legend. People said that true love is not a magical gift of fate, but a road that two people build together, stone by stone. And if that road is laid with patience, respect, and shared labour, neither another's will, nor distance, nor even a spell of forgetting can destroy it. For the most important roads remain not in memory, but in the heart. The palace where Prince Vashagan had grown up gleamed with gold, marble, and heavy fabrics. Yet with each passing year, it seemed more confining to him. In the throne room, the councillors' robes rustled softly, and the chains on their ceremonial belts chimed, while at the long table, his father and mother calmly discussed his future, as though it had already been written in a book. And all that remained was to turn the pages. They named the daughters of neighbouring kings and counted lands, caravans, gold, and old family ties. To the court, Vashagan's marriage was a convenient seal upon a treaty between kingdoms. He listened in silence. There was neither petulance in him, nor contempt for his duties. Yet he felt stifled. He did not yet know whom he would one day love, but he clearly felt one thing. He wanted to live his own life, not receive it ready-made from someone else's hands. For the first time in a long while, Vashagan felt free during a hunt. He urged his horse faster than he should have, and soon the pounding hooves of his retinue faded far behind him. Hot and dusty, he rode into the village of Hatsik, lying beneath the white noonday sun. A spring murmured beside the road. Several girls stood nearby with clay pitchers. Vashagan dismounted and asked for water. One of the girls, Anahit, the daughter of a shepherd, looked at him calmly. She neither bowed nor fussed over him. She lifted the first pitcher and slowly poured the cold water onto the scorching ground beside his boots. The dust darkened and hissed softly. Then she emptied the second vessel in the same way. Only then did Anahit fill a pitcher again and hold it out to him. The damp clay cooled his palms. Vashagan drank in small sips and suddenly realized that she had cooled not only his thirst, but also the hot-headedness with which he had galloped there. For the first time that day, he was in no hurry to go anywhere. Vashagan lowered the pitcher and frowned. He was accustomed to servants hurrying to carry out an order at his first word, and the girl's calm deliberation struck him as insolence. "Why did you pour out the water when I asked for a drink?" he demanded sharply. Anahit did not look away. "You are overheated, traveller. Your blood is still boiling from the ride. If you had drunk icy water at once, you might have fallen gravely ill. I poured it out so that you would have time to cool down and catch your breath." Vashagan's anger vanished as quickly as though cool water had been splashed over it as well. Before him stood a girl who was not afraid of his irritation and did not try to please him. She spoke simply and without flattery, as she would to any weary traveller whose health mattered more than his impatience. No one in the palace ever spoke to him that way, and that impressed him even more than her beauty. Vashagan thanked Anahit, watered his horse, and returned to the palace by evening. Everything there remained the same. The gold on the walls, the servants' quiet footsteps, the councillors' cautious voices. But now all that familiar luxury seemed especially empty to him. At supper, he barely listened to the conversation. He kept seeing Hatsik, the scorching dust, the cold water, and the steady gaze of the girl, who felt no fear of his name. She had seen in him neither a prince nor a future ruler, nor a profitable part of an alliance, but merely a tired man who might be harmed by haste. And the more Vashagan thought about it, the clearer his feelings became. All the courtesy of the palace suddenly paled beside that simple human concern at the spring. That night, he understood that he would seek no other bride. Vashagan did not want to delay. The very next morning he summoned Nazar, his most faithful servant, and ordered him to set out for Hatsik. Nazar did not arrive at the home of the shepherd Aaron empty-handed. Behind him came servants carrying costly fabrics, silverware, jewelry, and a chest of gold, everything befitting a royal proposal of marriage. Entering the modest, sturdy house, he bowed to its master and respectfully asked for Anahit's hand on behalf of Prince Vashagan. Nazar expected amazement, tears of joy, and gratitude for such an honor. But Aaron merely looked calmly at the lavish gifts. "My daughter is not a possession for me to give away," he said. "Her fate belongs to her alone. If the prince wishes to take her as his wife, let him ask her. And for the first time, Nazar understood that in this simple home, a person's will was valued more highly than royal gold. Nazar left Aran's house, still surprised by his answer, and asked where he might find Anahit. He was directed to a broad yard behind the house, where village children sat beneath the dense crown of an old tree. Anahit was among them. She was patiently showing one boy how to form a letter more evenly on a wax tablet, guiding his hand with a light touch of her fingers. Nearby, two girls sorted coloured woolen threads on a small loom, while Anahit explained which thread to lift and which to let pass. The wood creaked softly, the wool rustled, and letters were repeated in hushed voices. Nazar stopped at a distance. He had expected to see a shepherd's daughter overwhelmed by news of the prince. But instead, he saw a person around whom a little world of her own already existed. A calm, useful, orderly world. Everyone there was occupied with some task and felt needed. For the first time, Nazar understood why her father had spoken with such confidence. Nazar approached Anahit, bowed, and delivered Prince Vashagan's proposal. He spoke solemnly, already expecting to see joy upon her face. But Anahit did not abandon her work. She calmly finished the row on the little loom, straightened a woolen thread, and only then raised her eyes. "I thank him for the honour," she said, "but I cannot accept this proposal." Nazar froze. Refuse a prince, the future ruler of the kingdom? Anahit seemed to read his thoughts. "Tell your master that I will not marry a man who knows only how to hunt and command the labour of others. A person who knows no craft does not know the true value of labour. And without understanding labour, it is difficult to understand the value of life itself." There was neither defiance nor pride in her voice. She said it simply, as though stating a rule long proven by time. And Nazar understood that neither gold nor title would make her abandon her conviction. Anahit noticed how shaken Nazar was and spoke more gently. "Do not think that I wish to humiliate the prince. Title and wealth are like the wind. They are beside you today and may vanish tomorrow. A king can lose his throne, a rich man all his gold. But what a person has learned to do with his own hands will remain with him even in misfortune." She ran her palm along the smooth edge of the little loom and added, "Tell Vashagan that I will agree to become his wife if he masters a true craft. Not as a test, and not for the sake of my pride. I want to know that the man beside me can make something useful himself, and will not be lost if one day neither servants nor palace are there." Nazar listened in silence. Now Anahit's condition seemed to him not insolence, but concern for a future that no one but her had yet been able to foresee. Nazar returned to the palace with a heavy heart and conveyed Anahit's answer to Vashagan. The moment he finished, an indignant murmur swept through the throne room. The councillors reddened, exchanged glances, and called the shepherd girl's words insolence and an insult to the crown. "Punish her," came a cry from among the courtiers. But Vashagan raised a hand, and the hall fell silent. There was no anger on his face. On the contrary, he smiled, calmly and almost joyfully. While others heard humiliation in Anahit's words, he heard the truth. She had not demanded the impossible of him. She had merely shown him something he had never noticed before. His entire life was surrounded by the labor of others. Yet he himself did not know how to create anything. "She is right," Vashagan said. "I accept her condition. From this day forward, I will learn a craft." And for the first time, the path he had chosen truly belonged to him alone. That same day, Vashagan chose weaving, the very craft Anahit taught to the village children. A large wooden loom was installed in his chambers, and the oldest and most skillful weaver in the palace became his teacher. From the first lessons, the loom seemed to be testing the prince. The heavy shuttle knocked dully against the frame. The treadles creaked beneath his feet, and the threads whispered as they slipped between his fingers. The wool, dyed with herbs and roots, smelled of dry meadows, but the beauty of the craft came through pain. The coarse yarn cut his unaccustomed hands, blood welled on his fingers, and the fine silk threads tangled and snapped. Vashagan grew angry with himself, began again and again, and could not find the proper rhythm. At times the loom seemed unbearably slow. At others it demanded such speed that his thoughts could not keep pace with his hands. The old master patiently corrected every mistake without a needless word. And still, each evening, the prince remained with him longer than he had the day before. Months passed. Vashagan studied every day and asked the old master for neither indulgence nor praise. Sometimes the pattern came out uneven and the threads went awry, forcing him to undo several hours of work. The prince would sigh heavily, gather the yarn, and sit down at the loom once more. Gradually, his fingers ceased to hurry. The shuttle settled confidently into his palm. His movements became fluid, and the measured beat of the loom no longer irritated him, but soothed him. Now Vashagan was beginning to understand Anahit's words. Every piece of fabric concealed hours of concentration, patience, weary eyes, and precise hands. He no longer saw merely a carpet or a garment, but someone's life woven among the threads. And as his skill changed, so did he. He became more patient, attentive, and calm. Thus labor taught the prince the value of things better than dozens of palace tutors ever had. Exactly 1 year later, Vashagan removed his finest work from the loom. Before him lay a length of the most delicate cloth, light, even, and woven with such precision that not a single thread strayed from the pattern. The colours he had chosen were not the loud and lavish colours of the palace, but deep, tranquil shades, like the shadow of a tree, dry earth, and cool spring water. Vashagan gazed at the fabric for a long time, remembering the first cuts on his fingers, the tangled threads, and the months of patience. Then he rolled it up carefully. He attached no letter, no royal seal, and no oath. He knew now that true work spoke for its maker, and Anahit would be able to read this silent message. At dawn, Vashagan summoned Nazar and ordered him to take the fabric to Hatzik. Woven into it was an entire year of his labour, and the answer to the condition that had once changed his life. A year later, Nazar rode into Hatzik once more and stopped at the familiar house of Aaron the shepherd. This time, however, no servants followed him with chests of gold, and no foreign fabrics or jewels glittered behind him. In his hands, he held only a single neatly wrapped bundle. He found Anahit in the yard. As before, she was occupied with her work, calmly sorting the threads at a small loom. Nazar approached and bowed to her more deeply than he had the first time. Now his bow expressed not only respect for the prince's possible bride, but also sincere admiration for her wisdom. Without a word, he held out the bundle. "This is the answer of my master, Prince Vashagan, to your condition," Nazar said. He added nothing more. Grand speeches would have been out of place. Anahit accepted the bundle carefully, and for a moment the yard itself seemed to fall silent in expectation. Anahit slowly unfolded the bundle, and the room grew so quiet that only the faint rustle of the cloth could be heard. She did not admire the gift as one admires something costly. Her fingers glided over the surface, testing the evenness of the tension, the density of the weave, and the precision of every edge. Then Anahit raised the cloth to the light and studied its restrained, intricate pattern for a long while. To her, it spoke more clearly than any letter. In the even threads she saw months of patience, sleepless evenings, pricked fingers, and mistakes that had to be unravelled and begun again. She also saw what gold could never buy: pride overcome, discipline, and true mastery. Anahit's face gradually brightened. Vashagan had not asked a craftsman to do the work for him, nor had he tried to deceive her with beautiful words. He had truly changed himself. She passed her palm over the cloth once more and smiled softly. Her answer to the prince was now perfectly clear. Anahit ran her hand over Vashagan's fabric once more, rolled it up carefully, and pressed it to her chest. A gentle, warm smile touched her lips, but she said nothing aloud. Instead of answering, Anahit rose and went into the workshop. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a heavy carpet that she herself had woven over many long evenings. Its pattern intertwined the deep colours of earth, grass, and the evening sky, and every line was measured with a master's precision. She handed the carpet to Nazar. "Take this to your master," was all Anahit said. Nazar understood everything without explanation. This was more than a gift in return. The carpet was her consent, her quiet yes, spoken in a language the two of them now understood. Vashagan had proved that he had become a master, and Anahit answered him as an equal. When Nazar returned to the palace and unrolled Anahit's carpet before Vashagan, the prince understood her answer at once. He gazed at the pattern for a long time, recognizing in every line the patience of hands he knew, and his heart filled with a quiet, profound joy. The wedding took place soon afterward, but it was nothing like the lavish palace celebrations once prepared for advantageous alliances. There were no endless toasts, no recitations of lands, gold, and the antiquity of noble families. Relatives, friends, craftspeople, and the people of Hatzik gathered in a bright hall. Vashagan and Anahit stood side by side, calm and certain. Those before the gathering were no longer a prince and a shepherd's daughter, but two equals, each of whom knew the value of the other's labour. They were joined neither by profit nor by another's will. Over that year, they themselves had woven the foundation of their future, from respect, patience, and trust. The years passed. Time slowly changed the palace and the kingdom. The old councillors turned grey, children grew, and masters passed their crafts on to apprentices. The day came when the former king and queen passed quietly and honourably from life, leaving power to Vashagan and Anahit. Now mature, they accepted the crown, not as a privilege, but as a grave duty. Vashagan remembered the long hours at the loom, and knew how much labour was hidden in every simple thing. Anahit, meanwhile, never forgot the village yard, the children, the shepherds, and the workshops of Hatzik. Their decisions were therefore rarely born of whim. They listened to craftspeople, protected farmers, and ensured that the laws were fair to rich and poor alike. Under their rule, the kingdom lived without fear. The fields yielded crops, the roads were safe, and a person's labour was valued more highly than grand titles. Upon becoming queen, Anahit did not turn into a silent ornament of the throne. Costly gowns and lavish feasts interested her far less than the lives of the people beyond the palace walls. She sat beside Vashagan at councils of state, listened attentively to the nobles, and rarely spoke first. But when arguments became entangled in ambition, profit, and court intrigue, her quiet voice returned the discussion to what mattered. Whom would the decision help, and whom would it harm? At times, one simple question from Anahit demolished a cunning scheme over which the counselors had argued for hours. Vashagan remembered that clear gaze at the spring and had long since learned to trust her insight. In the most difficult matters, he often asked her first, "And what do you think?" Anahit answered honestly, even when her opinion contradicted his own. Thus the mind of a shepherd's daughter, which had once changed one prince, now served an entire kingdom. Even wise rule could not protect the palace from the quietest danger of all: flattery. Anahit noticed it before anyone else. With each passing year, more and more people around Vachigan learned to guess which words would sound most pleasing to royal ears. Ministers reported abundant harvests, governors assured him that the people were content, and courtiers vied with one another in proclaiming universal prosperity. And yet, Anahit heard an alarming false note in those speeches. The reports were too polished, the praises too much alike. Other news reached her as well. Distant villages lacked grain. Certain governors collected excessive taxes, and the grievances of ordinary people sometimes never reached the capital. She saw a soft web gradually being spun around the throne. It neither choked nor frightened. On the contrary, it caressed the ear. But that was precisely what made it so dangerous. Anahit understood that if Vachigan heard only pleasing truths, one day he would cease to know his own kingdom. One evening, after yet another splendid reception had ended and the doors had closed behind the last courtier, Anahit remained alone with Vachigan. "Be wary, my king," she said quietly. "It is far too easy for a palace to mistake the people's obedient silence for their peace." Vachigan looked at her closely. A king who does not see the lives of his subjects with his own eyes rules not a country, but only his palace and his ministers' illusions. Take off your crown for a time. Dress as an ordinary merchant or traveler. Leave your guards behind and go where no one will recognize you. She spoke not as a subject, but as his closest and most honest friend. Listen to what people say at markets, in workshops, and in villages when no royal officials are near. Only then will you learn the truth that cannot be heard from a throne. Vachigan was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. The advice was difficult, and therefore right. Vachigan did not postpone acting upon Anahit's counsel. He knew the value of her words too well, and understood that the truth about the kingdom could not be seen from the window of a palace carriage. Late that night, he took off his embroidered silk garments and left behind his rings and emblems of royal power. In their place, he donned the plain but sturdy robe of a traveling merchant. In a small satchel, he placed a little money, a change of clothing, and enough bread for the first days of the journey. Only Anahit, and his two most trusted servants, disguised as drovers, knew of his departure. Vachagan wished neither to alarm the court nor to give the ministers time to prepare a beautiful lie for him. At dawn, the three travellers slipped unnoticed out of the capital. The crown remained in the palace, while ahead lay dusty roads, villages, and unfamiliar faces. For the first time, Vachagan was setting out to look upon his kingdom not through the eyes of a ruler, but through those of an ordinary man. Travelling through distant villages, Vachagan saw what had been absent from the reports at court. Impoverished settlements, neglected roads, and officials demanding extra payment. With each day, his resolve grew stronger to return and correct what the court preferred to conceal. But one day, the small caravan he had joined entered a narrow mountain gorge. Stones suddenly rained down from above. Shouts echoed between the cliffs, and bandits leaped onto the road. Everything happened too quickly. Several guards were disarmed. The rest fled. Vachagan tried to fight back, but without his sword and royal guard, he proved as vulnerable as any traveller. He was knocked to the ground, bound and searched. Judging by his well-made clothes, the bandits decided that their captive was a wealthy merchant. They exchanged satisfied glances. Such a man could command a handsome ransom. Thus the king, who had set out to seek the truth about his realm, found himself at the mercy of its lawlessness. Vachagan was blindfolded and led for a long time along narrow mountain paths. Stones crunched beneath his feet. The cold wind gave way to clammy heat, until at last he was stopped and the blindfold removed. Before him opened a vast cavern. Water dripped from the vaults, and the air smelled of smoke, wet stone, and old clothing. Near the entrance, a dark lake glimmered faintly. Its shores curved in an unusual shape, a long crescent of a young moon encircled by black cliffs. Several fires burned deep inside the cavern. Dozens of captives crowded around them, merchants, craftspeople, and peasants. The emaciated people sat in silence, warming their hands over the feeble flames and trying not to meet the bandits' eyes. Vachagan was shoved roughly toward the others. No one there knew that a king stood before them. For the first time in his life, his title meant absolutely nothing. Vachagan's eyes gradually adjusted to the gloom. He studied the captives' faces, weary, gaunt, and nearly devoid of hope. Then suddenly he froze. In a far corner, an old man was repairing cracked horse tack. His hands trembled with age, but worked with confidence. Vachagan recognized Nazar, the faithful servant who had disappeared many years before while carrying out an errand. Their eyes met. Nazar gave the faintest shake of his head. Say nothing. Before long, Fashagan overheard the bandits talking and learned the terrible rule of that place. No one there asked about title or birth. Only those who proved useful were kept alive. Blacksmiths, carpenters, saddlers, and other skilled workers. The rest were merely a needless burden to the gang. Then the words Anahit had spoken long ago in Hatsik returned to him with frightening clarity. His crown was worthless here. His royal name could not save him. Only one thing could: the skill of his own hands. In the morning, the bandit chief slowly walked among the new captives, deciding which of them deserved to remain alive. When he reached Fashagan, he seized his hands, inspected his palms closely, and sneered with contempt. "You do not look like a craftsman, merchant, and we feed no one here for nothing. What can you make with your own hands? Answer, or you will become food for the fish in the lake." Fashagan felt everything inside him turn cold. This was the very moment Anahit had warned him of so many years ago. Should he declare himself king? Here that could only doom him or turn him into a captive for whom they would demand ransom without end. Neither army, nor wealth, nor name could help him now. He slowly lifted his eyes to the chief. "I am a weaver," Fashagan said calmly, "and I can prove it with my work." Fashagan straightened, forcing himself not to show his fear. "I am no ordinary weaver," he said evenly. "I can create cloth of such fineness and beauty that its method of manufacture is known to me alone." The chief narrowed his eyes, and Fashagan continued. "Any queen would pay you a sack of gold for a small length of such fabric. Kill me, and you will lose a fortune that is walking straight into your hands." He spoke calmly, knowing exactly where to aim his words. A familiar gleam of greed was already kindling in the bandit's eyes. The chief remained silent for several moments more, torn between his habitual cruelty and the promise of easy profit. At last he smirked. "Very well, weaver. You may live for now, but if you have lied, you will regret it." Fashagan bowed his head. The first step had been taken. He had bought himself time, not with gold or a royal name, but with skill and intelligence. The bandits did not delay. The promise of gold proved more effective than any command. Within a few days, they brought a roughly built loom from the nearest town, along with fine silk and gold thread, the best they had been able to obtain. The loom was set up in a far corner of the cave. Above it, a small oil lamp smoked, casting quivering light upon the wet stone walls. Fashagan sat on a low bench and placed his palms upon the rough wood. Once those hands had worn royal rings and touched precious fabrics in the palace. Now he was surrounded by damp, cold, and armed bandits. But he felt no humiliation. The crude loom seemed to him not an instrument of captivity, but a road to freedom. Fine threads once again lay between his fingers, and for the first time since his capture, Vashagan felt genuine hope. Vashagan began to weave. In the stillness of the cave, the shuttle beat steadily, the treadles creaked, and the taut threads rustled. That peaceful rhythm reminded him of the palace workshop and seemed to stretch a slender thread all the way back home. But now every line of the pattern carried a double meaning. By alternating colors, changing the direction of the weave, and leaving barely perceptible breaks in the symmetry, Vashagan composed a secret message in a language that only two people could read, he and Anahit. Through the threads, he revealed that he was alive but held captive, and that faithful Nazar was beside him. Then, in the very center of the cloth, he wove the principal sign. A dark lake, shaped like the crescent of a young moon, confined between tall black cliffs. For hours the bandits watched the swift movements of his fingers. They marveled at the gleam of the gold and the intricacy of the ornament, imagining sacks of future coins. None of them understood that the beautiful cloth had already become a plea for rescue and a map to their secret refuge that would one day lead there the very people they feared. At last the work was finished. Vashagan removed the shimmering cloth from the loom and handed it to the bandit chief. The chief unfurled it before the fire. The gold threads flared in the trembling light, and the silk shimmered softly with every movement. The bandits crowded close, running rough fingers over the pattern, estimating its weight, and already arguing over how much gold they could obtain for it. No one noticed the secret signs. "You did not deceive us, merchant," the chief said with a satisfied grin. "They will heap out its weight in gold for a thing like this. You will live as long as you can weave more of the same." Vashagan merely bowed his head calmly. He watched as the cloth was carefully rolled up and hidden away for sale. The bandits saw wealth in it. He saw the only way out of the cave. Slender, fragile, and already setting off to meet Anahit. The chief chose two of his most cunning men and ordered them to travel to the capital. The bandits dressed in the rich garments of foreign merchants, concealed weapons beneath their cloaks, and carefully placed the precious cloth inside an ornate bundle. On the road, they were already dividing the future profit. Such a thing, they decided, could not be offered at an ordinary market. There could be only one buyer for it: the royal court. At the palace gates, the bandits carried themselves with confidence and importance. "We have brought a marvel worthy of Queen Anahit's own eyes," one of them announced to the guards. "No other fabric like it exists anywhere." The guards exchanged glances. Gold thread glinted through the folds of the bundle, and the merchant's story sounded convincing enough. Before long, news of the extraordinary wares was passing through the palace corridors. The bandits did not suspect that they themselves had brought Anahit the first true clue to her missing husband. Vashagan's long absence had left Anahit worn with worry. Thus, When she was told of foreign merchants with a rare cloth, she agreed to view their wares almost indifferently. In the throne room, the bandits pompously unfurled the cloth directly upon the marble floor. The courtiers gasped. The gold threads glimmered, and the intricate pattern shimmered in the window light. But Anahit did not say a word. She stood motionless as the color slowly drained from her face. Stepping closer, the queen ran her fingers along the selvage. That tension of the threads, that almost invisible knot. She herself had once helped Fashagan master such a technique. No one else could have woven in precisely that way. Anahit's heart beat faster. She was no longer looking at the beauty of the cloth. Her eyes moved from symbol to symbol, noticing repetitions, breaks in the symmetry, and alternations of color. Gradually, the pattern ceased to be an ornament. A letter unfolded before her. Among the golden threads, she seemed to hear Fashagan's quiet, desperate voice. Her husband was alive, and he was calling to her for help. To Anahit, the pattern was no longer a mystery. The repeated signs, colors, and broken symmetry formed a clear message. Fashagan was alive. He was a captive. Nazar was beside him, and they must be sought in a cave by a dark lake shaped like the crescent of a young moon. Anahit's heart pounded with horror and relief, but her face remained calm. "Beautiful work," she said coldly to the merchants. "The treasurer will pay you as much gold as this cloth weighs." The bandits could barely conceal their delight. "And if you can find this craftsman again, bring me more of his work. I will reward you generously." They bowed and left, certain that they had made the best bargain of their lives. Anahit waited until the doors had closed, and only then quietly ordered the captain of the guard, "Follow them. Do not let them out of your sight for a single step." Vashagan's rescue had begun. As soon as the doors closed behind the bandits, Anahit sprang into action. She did not convene a large council of war or raise the entire army. Too much commotion could warn the enemy and doom the captives. The queen secretly summoned the captain of the guard and ordered him to select several dozen of the most experienced warriors, loyal and patient people who knew how to move in silence. Before them, Anahit spread out Fashagan's cloth and pointed to the principal sign. "Search the wild mountains for a dark lake shaped like the crescent of a young moon. The cave must be nearby." Then she removed her palace gown, put on plain traveling clothes and a cloak, and tightened her belt. The captain of the guard tried to object, but Anahit only shook her head. "Vashagan came for me himself when he had to prove his love. Now it is my turn to go after him." Before dawn, the small company had already left the capital. Anahit's company travelled with almost no rest. Scouts who had secretly followed the bandits from the capital rode ahead, and guided by their signs, the horsemen passed ever deeper into the wild mountains. By twilight, the road narrowed between black cliffs. Anahit raised her hand, and the company stopped. Below lay a lake, dark, deep, and curved in the exact crescent of a young moon. She recognized it immediately. This was the very curve Vashagan had woven into the golden pattern of his message. There could be no doubt now. Beyond a ridge of stone, the scouts noticed a narrow cave entrance. Anahit ordered everyone to dismount. Swords were drawn soundlessly from their sheaths. The horses were led away, and the warriors, dividing into groups, silently surrounded the cliffs. Now they had only to wait for the depths of night. Anahit looked at the black water and knew that somewhere very near, beyond that wall of stone, Vashagan was still waiting for her. Deep in the night, when the bandits, celebrating their successful sail, had grown drunk and fallen asleep beside the dying fires, Anahit gave the signal. The warriors entered the cave without a sound. One by one, they took the weapons from the sleepers, bound their hands, and blocked the exits. Several bandits managed to leap up, but their resistance was extinguished before the sound of battle could spread through the cavern. Anahit was already running forward with a torch. Its light glided over the wet walls and the frightened faces of the captives, then suddenly stopped. Vashagan sat beside the crude loom. He was gaunt and exhausted, but alive. Old Nazar rose beside him. For several moments, the husband and wife simply looked at each other, as though unable to believe that the distance between them had finally vanished. Anahit approached and took Vashagan's hands in hers. "I read your letter," she said quietly. He smiled. That night, not only the king and Nazar received their freedom. The guards cut the bonds of every captive. Vashagan returned to the palace, not as an invincible warrior, but as a man who had seen how helpless power could be in the face of true disaster. He assembled the courtiers and told them everything without concealment. "In that cave, my crown was worth less than dirt," the king said. "Two things saved me. The craft Anahit once made me learn, and her wisdom, which enabled her to read my work. The bandits received a just punishment. The freed captives returned home, and old Nazar was richly rewarded for his loyalty and courage." Afterward, Vashagan and Anahit ruled together for many more years, in trust, respect, and love. And in their kingdom, a simple truth was passed down from one generation to the next. Gold can be lost, a title taken away, power destroyed. But knowledge and skill gained through one's own labor remain with a person and make that person truly strong and free. Geraint was slowly returning to his native lands. He was young, but his name had long been wreathed in the legends of King Arthur's stern court. His strong hands, accustomed to the heavy hilt of a sword, held the reins with confidence. Yet his handsome face bore the deep mark of a weariness built up over years of endless tournaments, treacherous court intrigues, and the exhausting need always to remain the best. Now, as he accepted the heavy burden of power from his aging father, Geraint sought only one thing. He wore his great fame like a heavy cloak, and more than anything in the world, he dreamed of finding a quiet harbour, a place where that cloak could be left at the door. He desperately needed a safe refuge where steel armour no longer constricted his chest. A place where he could finally release the tension and simply breathe without expecting a treacherous blow. He yearned desperately for absolute, unshakable peace. Geraint found relief from his crushing weariness where he least expected it. In the half-ruined castle of her impoverished father, he saw Enid for the first time. No jewels sparkled upon her. She wore a simple, faded dress. Yet she moved with the grace and dignity of a true queen. There was more genuine majesty in her worn gown than in all the silks of the royal court. And in her eyes, he found the very peace he had sought for so long. He fell in love, not only with her gentle beauty. He was captivated by her unbreakable inner calm, by that astonishing, radiant resilience, so painfully absent from the hypocritical clamour of Arthur's court. Among the old ruins, she shone like an undying light in a window. Enid became a firm foundation, a flawless embodiment of purity. She became his true home, the place worth fighting for, and to which he always longed to return. Once they became husband and wife, they plunged headlong into a closed circle of absolute, serene happiness. In their new, carefully arranged life, there was no room at all for noisy feasts, courtly bustle, or exhausting military campaigns. Now their time was filled only with long, tender evenings by the blazing hearth, quiet music, reading together, and endless intimate conversations until dawn. Geraint loved Enid so deeply and feared so desperately that he might lose his newfound peace, that he began diligently shutting their world away from everything outside it. He wanted to be with her alone, making his wife the sole meaning and centre of his universe. Their idyllic life gradually turned into a stifling cocoon soaked in thick, sweet syrup. Their love became an impregnable fortress, but with each passing day, that fortress looked more and more like a beautiful, cozy prison, locked tightly from within. Their sweet seclusion soon began to bear rotten fruit. Geraint, once a formidable warrior and a just lord, began to forget his duty as a ruler. He stopped riding along the borders of his own lands, continually postponed important hearings, and no longer listened to the anxious counsel of his faithful advisers. His renowned heavy sword now hung on the wall as a useless ornament, while his loyal war-horse languished in its stall. The great love that should have become a reliable source of strength for new endeavours turned into a convenient excuse for total inaction. Geraint was rapidly dissolving into domestic comfort, imperceptibly losing his masculine essence and former identity. He hid so deeply in his wife's embrace from the troubles of the world that he forgot whoever takes off his armor forever eventually forgets how to hold a sword. The outside world did not vanish behind the closed doors of their quiet bedchamber. The kingdom could not exist for long without the firm hand of a ruler, and poisonous whispers soon began to spread through the court. People said with disapproval that the young lion had hopelessly lost his fangs. It was rumoured that he had grown utterly weak, exchanging his former chivalrous honour and the ring of swords for the silk of women's skirts. Serious doubts arose about his ability to defend his own lands. His once resounding fame rapidly faded, while old enemies at the borders had already begun boldly raising their heads. The many-voiced whisper of the discontented court was like weeds and poisonous ivy, rapidly winding around the walls of their motionless palace. Rumours crept through its corridors like drafts, and in their cold murmur, the great warrior's name was heard more and more often, not with admiration, but with mocking pity. The court's cruel whispers inevitably reached Enid's ears. When she heard the malicious talk, she did not grow angry with the gossips, or accuse her beloved husband of weakness and idleness. The unbearable weight of those words fell upon her fragile shoulders. Enid was tormented by a terrible, destructive thought. By becoming his greatest happiness, she herself had imperceptibly become his most vulnerable weakness. Once, she had loved with all her heart a strong, vigorous knight, a hero with fire in his eyes. Now she did not want to be the stifling golden cage in which his true, manly nature was suffocating beyond recovery. It caused her unbearable pain to watch his great potential swiftly fade because of her. It seemed to her that her love had become a heavy velvet blanket beneath which he was suffocating, gradually forgetting how to breathe deeply in the wind. Enid clearly understood that she had to act. Only an open, honest conversation could save his honour. Yet she was constantly held back by a paralysing, clinging fear. She trembled at the thought that her husband might take her sincere words as cruel ingratitude for his boundless, all-consuming love. Enid desperately feared becoming the person who would destroy their cosy world with her own hands, roughly thrusting Geraint back into the cold, brutal reality of cynical politics and bloody wars from which he had tried so hard to hide. This agonizing inner conflict between the wish to save him and the fear of hurting him forced her to remain silent day after day, storing her mounting anxiety deep within, like heavy water behind a high dam. She said nothing, afraid that a word of truth would be the stone that shattered the glass dome of their fragile happiness, not realizing that in its stifling air They were already both struggling to breathe. There came one of those early, grey, misty mornings when the entire castle was still submerged in deep sleep. Geraint slept peacefully in their enormous bed, safely covered by a heavy blanket, seeming to have finally shut himself off from every care of the outside world. But Enid had been awake for a long time. Wrapped in a shawl, she stood alone at the window and gazed sorrowfully through the glass at the cold world awakening in the mist. The very world her husband no longer wished either to see or to protect. Her fragile shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly with bitter, silent tears of utter helplessness and immense, nearly suffocating love for her sleeping husband. She gazed through the cold glass at the world waiting for its king, and her tears were a wordless prayer that her husband might find himself once more. Standing motionless at the window, Enid believed that Geraint was immersed in deep sleep. She could no longer contain the feelings overflowing within her, and hot tears silently rolled down her pale cheeks. In the half-darkness of the bedchamber, she spoke softly to herself in a barely audible whisper. How immeasurably sad that these strong hands, made for truly great deeds and for the defense of our kingdom, now serve me alone. How bitter it is to realize that my blind love has become the chief cause of his present weakness and the swift decline of his great renown. There was not a trace of reproach in her trembling voice, only heartbreaking pain and boundless tenderness for her husband. She whispered those words to the cold glass, like a confession of the most terrible sin, believing herself guilty of taming a lion and forgetting that a lion was born for the open plains. Geraint awoke at the sound of her quiet weeping. Through the dim veil of fading sleep, only fragments of bitter phrases about weakness and strong hands born for great deeds reached him. In an instant, his mind painfully distorted the meaning of what she had said. He heard not the sincere concern of a loving wife, but a cruel, contemptuous accusation. Somewhere deep within, Geraint had long felt a gnawing guilt over his prolonged inaction and dreaded the inevitable judgment. Now that carefully hidden fear had suddenly taken on flesh. His wounded pride instantly painted a dreadful picture. Enid had become hopelessly disappointed in him as a man. In his madness, he imagined that she secretly longed for someone else, a more active and powerful warrior. Her compassionate words fell into the soil of his own unspoken fears and sprouted poisonous thorns of jealousy and wounded pride. Geraint did not ask a single question. He deliberately denied Enid even the slightest chance to explain herself. In that fatal moment, only his deeply wounded pride, burning resentment, and unbearable shame that his carefully concealed weakness had been noticed were crying out within him. He continued to lie motionless, but his heart was rapidly becoming covered by a thick crust of ice. Geraint made a firm decision. He would not humiliate himself with pitiful excuses. Instead, he would prove to her, and first of all to himself, that he was still the great knight she had once loved. He would prove it not with empty words, but with merciless deeds, choosing the harshest path possible. He chose not to uncover the truth, but to believe his resentment, raising between them a wall of silence stronger than stone. Geraint rose sharply from the bed. In a single instant, he became unbearably cold and distant, like a stranger. Without looking his wife in the eye, he began giving short, harsh orders. He announced that he was setting out immediately, alone, without a retinue, into wild and dangerous lands, to stir his stagnant blood. Enid was deeply shaken by this icy coldness. She did not understand what had caused it, but she could see clearly that her husband was fleeing from himself and from her in despair. Then she made an incredibly difficult, mature decision. She resolved that she would not let him enter this terrible inner storm alone. Despite his rejection, Enid would ride with him. He was putting on his armor to flee his own pain, but she saw his wound and chose to become his shadow so that he would not perish in solitude. Early on an autumn cold morning, bewildered servants saddled the horses. The atmosphere of the hurried preparations was oppressive, unbearably tense and heavy. Enid did not pack the luxurious dresses her husband had generously given her. Deliberately, she took from the very bottom of her chest her simple, faded travelling dress, the same one she had worn when Geraint first saw her in her father's ruined home. It was a symbolic and deeply conscious gesture. Enid was firmly renouncing the status of queen, so that she could once again be simply a woman, prepared to share every hardship with him. She was ready for the approaching trials, though she had no understanding at all of her guilt. She put on the old dress, not as a reproach to him, but as armor, remembering that once, in those very faded threads, he had recognized her true worth. Geraint saw that she was ready for the journey. Deep in his heart, he still could not renounce her, and did not forbid her to come. But his face remained stern and unyielding. He imposed only one harsh condition on her. "You will ride with me, if that is what you have decided," he said coldly and distantly. "But ride ahead, and I ask you to remain absolutely silent. If you regret our life together, do not comfort me with empty words or show me your pity. Say nothing to me until I speak to you myself." Enid nodded silently, meekly accepting this harsh condition. He asked for silence not to punish her, but because he was terrified that the sound of her voice would confirm the dreadful thoughts he had planted in his own mind. Early on a misty morning, they silently left the walls of their native castle. A thick grey veil hung heavily over the ground, swallowing everything around them. The silence was broken only by the muffled beat of hooves on the wet road, the measured creak of saddles, and the piercing cry of a solitary bird. Geraint deliberately avoided the broad, busy roads. Stubbornly, he chose the most remote, abandoned forest trails and wild wastelands, desperately seeking not human company, but harsh trials and profound solitude. Ahead, through the cold mist, rode a fragile figure in a simple faded dress. Behind her, like a grim, dark shadow, followed an armed knight encased in steel. An insurmountable, frightening distance stretched between them. They travelled the same road, yet it seemed that each wandered through a separate, lonely desert, where the mist concealed not only the way, but also their hearts from one another. A heavy, physically palpable silence hung between them. For Geraint, that silence became the only way to shield himself from pain and gnawing doubt, an attempt to recover his former resolve through ostentatious severity. He stared at her fragile back, struggling painfully against the desire to speak. For Enid, the journey became a cruel trial of patience and boundless love. She rode ahead, constantly feeling his heavy, brooding gaze upon her back. She did not understand her guilt in the least, yet she accepted it without complaint. Her heart broke at being unable to turn, embrace her husband, and explain everything. But she faithfully kept her vow. The silence between them was heavier than any armor. He wore it like a shield to conceal his vulnerability, while she carried it like a cross, hoping that her patience would heal his pain. They entered an old, remote forest, where the dense crowns of enormous trees allowed almost no sunlight to pass, plunging the narrow trail into oppressive, gloomy twilight. Enid, obediently riding far ahead, had much keener hearing. Suddenly she sensed that something was wrong. A faint, unnatural rustling in the thick bushes, and the cold gleam of foreign steel in the deep forest shadows. The woman understood at once that a deadly ambush lay directly ahead. 3 ragged men, armed to the teeth, were preparing to fall suddenly upon the lone knight, immersed in his dark thoughts, and seize his mighty horse and costly armor. Geraint, riding slowly behind her, noticed nothing at all. His eyes were fixed only on the depths of his own resentment, making him utterly blind to any approaching danger. While Enid's gaze, filled with genuine concern for him, was sharper than a falcon's. Enid struggled desperately with herself. Her husband's recent cruel command, "Be silent," echoed coldly and relentlessly through her tense mind. She knew only too well that if she dared break her vow now, she would inevitably bring his icy anger and contempt upon herself. But through the leaves, she could clearly see that the hidden robbers had already tensed, ready to make their deadly attack. Time was running out, second by second. The difficult choice was made in an instant. Saving his life mattered incomparably more to her than obeying this humiliating, foolish rule. Enid wheeled her horse around, boldly breaking the distance he had imposed, and cried out with all her strength, "Geraint, beware! There is an ambush in the bushes." She knew she would pay for those words with his anger, but she would rather bear his fury than let his enemies take his life. At the sound of her desperate cry, Geraint came to his senses at once. His flawless, knightly reflexes instantly prevailed over his dark stupor. When the three robbers sprang furiously from ambush, he did not even flinch. The brief clash resembled not a glorious battle, but the harsh routine work of a true professional. Geraint parried their chaotic attack playfully and with little effort. He deliberately refrained from killing his assailants. Coldly, with frighteningly calculated blows, he disarmed them, demonstrating his overwhelming superiority in strength and skill. Casting their weapons to the ground, the robbers fled in wild terror. The victory did not please Geraint in the slightest. He remained as grim and distant as before. His sword moved with icy precision, knowing neither anger nor excitement. For the true battle that day was taking place not on the forest road, but within his own soul. After driving off the forest robbers, Geraint rode up to Enid. Instead of the words of gratitude she deserved for her timely warning, his face twisted with harsh irritation. In his wife's saving cry, he saw only confirmation of his darkest fears. She genuinely considered him weak and desperately in need of protection. "I asked you to remain silent," he said in an icy voice. "Do you truly think me so pathetic that I cannot deal with a handful of forest vagabonds? I have no need of your humiliating pity and concern." Abruptly ending the conversation, he ordered her to ride ahead again and maintain strict silence. This unjust reproach set the painful rhythm of the journey that followed. She had given him his life, and he cast that gift aside, seeing in it not an act of love, but one more proof of his imagined weakness. They rode in silence for several more long days. Each day brought new clashes, all of which followed the same cruel pattern. Enid warned him of danger in time. Geraint easily defeated his enemies, and then once again reproached his wife in an icy tone for disobeying his command. The tension between them reached its limit. At last they emerged from the dark forests and arrived in a large frontier town. When they stopped for the night at an inn, Geraint remained just as grim and withdrawn. He went to the stable to tend to the horses himself, leaving Enid alone in the crowded common room. The careless din of many voices and the idle bustle of the town contrasted sharply with their suffocating silence. They had entered a noisy city, but the silence they carried with them was so dense that it seemed stronger than the city walls. The ruler of this town, a powerful and immeasurably vain local count, happened to enter the noisy inn one evening with his lavish retinue. Almost immediately, his sharp gaze fell upon Enid, sitting modestly and entirely alone. Despite her old travelling dress, thickly covered in dust, the Count recognized without error her extraordinary beauty and innate, genuine nobility, which could never be concealed beneath coarse cloth. He also observed carefully how coldly and distantly Geraint behaved when he returned from the stable. The stern knight treated her as though Enid were not his lawful wife, but merely an obedient servant who had long since become tiresome. His experienced eye instantly assessed both the hidden splendor of her beauty and the evident poverty of her married happiness, and he decided that she would be easy prey. As soon as Geraint stepped away again for a short while, the treacherous Count confidently took a seat beside Enid. The Count began with flattery, but quickly came to the point. "Your husband does not value such a treasure," he whispered ingratiatingly. "He treats you like a servant. Why endure such humiliation? Become my lady. I will give you silks, power, and protection. You will live in a palace instead of wandering the forests with that madman." Enid angrily rejected his proposal. She declared that she was a faithful wife and would rather die in rags beside her husband than accept a crown from a traitor. He was offering her a golden cage in exchange for her honor, failing to understand that any cage was worse to her than a free road beside the man she loved, even one filled with pain. Enraged, the Count turned to threats. "Then I will dispose of your husband tomorrow at dawn, and you will be mine by force." Realizing that Geraint could never overcome an entire company of the town guard alone, Enid instantly changed her tactics. Feigning fear, she lowered her eyes submissively and said, "Very well, but do not do it now, or there will be an uproar. Come for me at dawn, before my husband wakes." Smirking smugly, the Count departed, certain of his victory. Deep in the night, however, when the town was asleep, Enid carefully awakened Geraint. Once again, fearlessly defying his order to remain silent, she whispered urgently, "The treacherous Count is preparing an ambush. We must flee now, before they surround us." They hastily saddled their horses and secretly left the inn, vanishing without a trace into the sheltering darkness of night before their enemies arrived. She had lied to the Count in order to save the truth of her love, and that night her cunning proved stronger than any knightly shield. The travellers rode onward, leaving settled lands behind and venturing deeper into a harsh and untamed wilderness. Over the course of that exhausting journey, Geraint defeated many enemies. He proved his martial valor more than sufficiently, but the succession of victories did not bring the long-awaited peace. Now the great knight looked utterly exhausted. His eyes were deeply sunken, his heavy posture stooped, and his once gleaming armour had irretrievably lost its noble lustre. Geraint was weary, not so much from fierce sword fights, as from the constant, agonizing tension within. He was being suffocated by his own pride, and by the solid wall of silence he himself had raised. He felt that he was gradually losing himself. His sword still struck without fail, but his soul bled in an invisible battle he waged against himself, losing it step by step. Worn out by the long road, they finally reached a broad plain. In the distance, a thick cloud of dust appeared. As he drew closer, Geraint saw a band of cruel mercenaries robbing and oppressing defenseless peasants with impunity. Desperate cries for help reached their ears. Despite his profound inner exhaustion and his dark state of mind, a true knight could not coldly ride past. His sacred duty as a protector awakened at once, eclipsing his weariness. Geraint sternly ordered Enid to remain at a safe distance. With a heavy motion, he lowered his solid visor and charged alone into the very midst of the enemy to drive them away. His movements were ponderous but deadly. He plunged into battle not for the sake of glory, which had long ceased to warm him, but because his sword, unlike his tormented heart, still remembered the meaning of justice. A brutal fight began. Geraint fought fiercely, and the mercenaries, who had never expected such powerful resistance from a lone knight, began retreating in terror. But Geraint was too exhausted. His reactions had become dangerously dull, and his attention was scattered by long days of oppressive silence and a grueling inner struggle. At the fatal moment, when he carelessly lowered his shield, convinced too soon of an easy victory, one of the retreating mercenaries struck him treacherously in the side with a spear. The sharp iron pierced his armor with a crunch. Terrified by what they had done, the mercenaries fled in panic. Geraint was left entirely alone on the battlefield. The wound was deep and bleeding terribly. The weariness he had stored within himself for so long finally found a breach in his armor, and the enemy's steel merely completed the work begun by his own pride. Geraint stubbornly ignored the bleeding wound. His pride would not allow him to ask for help or show weakness before Enid. Clenching his teeth, he silently mounted his horse and forced it onward as if nothing had happened. They rode a little farther, but with every step the knight lost more blood. Suddenly, an impenetrable darkness covered his eyes, and the ground seemed to vanish beneath the horse's hooves. In the ringing silence of the road, he fell heavily from the saddle with a deafening crash of armor, and lay motionless, unconscious. He collapsed into the dust of the road like a broken tree, and with him fell the entire invisible wall of silence and anger he had so carefully built between them. When she saw Geraint fall to the ground, Enid leaped from her horse with a piercing scream and rushed to him. In that dreadful moment, she forgot at once all his cruel commands, his recent coldness, and her own wounded pride. Nothing existed in the whole world now except her bleeding husband. Dropping to her knees before him in the road dust, she pulled off his heavy helmet with trembling hands. His face was as pale as linen, and he seemed no longer to be breathing. Horrified that he was dead, Enid burst into desperate sobs. Without a thought, she tore a broad strip from her faded dress and began binding the deep wound tightly, begging her beloved in a feverish voice not to leave her. All his foolish commands dissolved in her cry, and she wept over him, not as an obedient shadow, but as a woman whose very heart had just been torn away. A thick cloud of dust rose over the road. A large company of mounted warriors approached the place where Enid wept in despair, led by the local ruler, the cruel and capricious Count Limors. With one glance at the knight lying in the dust and the beautiful, tearful woman, the Count immediately made his decision. His motives were far from noble. He looked upon her tears not with compassion, but with the greed of a looter who had found a precious pearl among the wreckage of another man's shipwreck. At Limor's command, they were taken to the castle, but not to receive help. The unconscious Geraint was ordered to be thrown carelessly onto the stone floor in a corner of the huge, noisy dining hall, like unwanted refuse. Enid, meanwhile, was rudely commanded to join him at the Lord's table. Revelling in his absolute power, Limors cynically declared that since her husband was nearly dead, she was free from that moment on, and would certainly become his lawful wife, as well as the sovereign mistress of his wealthy castle. Count Limors seated himself at the lavish banquet table and tried to force Enid to eat, sweetly promising her untold riches if she would only stop weeping over the wretched dead man. But Enid overcame her paralyzing fear and proudly drew herself upright. Her fathomless grief suddenly gave way to angry resolve. "I will accept neither food nor water from you, not a morsel of bread nor a drop of wine," she declared loudly for the entire hall to hear. "I will not touch any food until my husband, the noble Geraint, rises and shares this meal with me." The enraged Count tried to strike her and force her into silence, but she did not retreat a single step. Her voice, trembling with grief, rang through the vast hall more strongly than steel, for it was the voice of a woman defending her knight's honor, even when his own sword lay in the dust. Meanwhile, Geraint, lying in a dark corner of the hall, was slowly regaining consciousness. The pain of his wound was sharp, but he did not move. Through the noise of the feast, he heard every word Enid spoke with perfect clarity. He heard her, weak and defenseless, fiercely defending him before the cruel ruler. At that moment, a flash of understanding came to his mind. The dark mist of doubt, pride, and resentment instantly dispersed. He saw the entire chain of events clearly. Her tears that morning had been born of concern. Her cries in the forest had been a desperate attempt to save him. And her courage now proved her absolute faithfulness. Geraint realized his terrible mistake. It was not her love that had been tested, but his ability to love without demanding obedience, and to trust without expecting betrayal. He himself had turned their happiness into a battlefield. And as he lay in the dirt of a stranger's castle, wounded and bleeding, he truly began to heal for the first time in many days. Because the veil of blind pride had fallen from his eyes forever. The realization of his guilt and of Enid's extraordinary devoted love worked upon Geraint more powerfully than any healing balm. He no longer felt the searing pain of his deep wound. His heart was filled only with cold, crystal-clear fury toward the man who had dared raise a hand against his wife. Swaying, yet gaining unbreakable resolve with every passing second, the knight slowly rose from the stone floor. His face remained deathly pale, but a terrible fire blazed in his eyes. Geraint drew his heavy sword, and the chilling ring of steel made the entire hall fall silent in terror. His mere appearance and the menacing aura of a celebrated warrior seemingly risen from the dead spread panic. The cowardly Lemurs and his mercenaries fled in terror. Geraint had risen not through the strength of his muscles, but through the pure force of truth understood at last. And his anger was no longer a blind destroyer, but a sharp scalpel cutting away falsehood. When the vast gloomy hall was completely empty, Geraint dropped his sword with a clang. His strength was rapidly leaving him, but he remained on his feet and slowly approached Enid. She stood trembling and weeping bitterly, unable to believe her eyes. The proudest knight in the kingdom slowly sank to his knees before her, not because of his bleeding wound, but as a sign of absolute humility. Gently taking her hands, he said with complete sincerity, "Forgive me, Enid. Forgive me for being blind to your love, because I was afraid of losing myself. I heard your concern, but mistook it for contempt. I punished you for my own fear and my own weakness." He knelt before her, acknowledging defeat in his war against his pride. And this was his greatest and most difficult knightly feat. Enid, whose heart knew no resentment, wept bright tears of joy and relief. She tenderly forgave her husband, helped him to his feet, and they embraced tightly. Soon they left Lemur's grim castle. The journey home began, and it was strikingly different from their recent travels. Now they did not ride apart, divided by cruel commands and silent anger. They rode close together, stirrup to stirrup, horse beside horse. The painful silence no longer hung between them, They spoke quietly and calmly, carefully healing one another's spiritual wounds. This shared road healed Geraint not only in body, but also in spirit. They were returning along the same road, but now it was the path not of two lonely prisoners of resentment, but of two travellers who had finally learned to share a single burden. Before long, they returned safely to their native kingdom. Geraint once again took the reins of power in a firm hand, and from that day onward, no one dared doubt his inexhaustible strength and courage. But now their life together was entirely different. They no longer hid from the whole world behind the high walls of the palace, nor did they flee themselves into the wild forests. Their boundless love ceased to be a solid wall and became instead a safe, warming hearth that gave them strength to serve their people wisely. At last, they learned truly to hear one another, entirely unafraid of the truth. Their union became unbreakable, having passed through the cruel fire of mistrust, and emerged crystal clear. They understood that true love is not a castle in which one can hide from storms, but a sturdy ship upon which two people can cross any tempest together, even the most terrible one of all.